Now, I want you guys to provide some cultural context here. The Prophet ﷺ said the best of women are those women who ride camels, the righteous women from Quraysh. So he's encouraging the men to marry from the women of Quraysh. Where's the Prophet ﷺ? Let's put some context here so this makes sense. Where's the Prophet ﷺ making this comment? Is this in Mecca or Medina? Question. Where's something like this, a comment like this, where's this taking place? In Mecca or Medina? In Medina, obviously. In Mecca, they weren't thinking about marriage and building families and the infrastructure of the community. They weren't focusing on that. But when they migrate to Medina, we're talking about building the infrastructure of the Muslim community, starting with building the masjid, then teaching classes in the masjid, and then begin, targeting, the matters dealing with marriage, divorce, raising families, taking on orphans. We're talking about building families, building communities. So when you think about it, the Prophet ﷺ is actually advocating for the women from his environment who migrated from Mecca to Medina. He never devalued them. He never migrated from Mecca to Medina and then kind of overlooked the women from Mecca who migrated along with him. You guys following me? He didn't forget about the women from his environment. He said the best of women are the women who ride camels. Who rode camels? The women from Mecca that migrated from Mecca to Medina, they rode in the heat of the desert sun. They rode in the desert on camels, on donkeys, some on feet, some sharing riding animals with others. He's highlighting a virtue of these women because they migrate to Medina. Some of them, they migrated to Medina. How did they migrate? How did they show up in Medina? All right, you're established. You live in Medina. This is your environment. This is your city. Some women, immigrants, they come from another city, migrating, coming to your city. How do they show up in Medina? How do the women from Mecca show up in Medina? Do they show up in Medina in a way or in a fashion that is desirable to the men in Medina? Or do they show up in a way where men are like, I don't think I want to marry any of those women?
No, they probably came with nothing. They were probably dusty, dirty. They look like they've been traveling.
Okay, keep going. How? Because we need to contextualize this. I'm trying to paint a picture for you of why the Prophet ﷺ would advocate for these women the way that he did. How did they show up in Medina?
Maybe I don't know. Maybe they were less than because they've been perceived poor.
If you left your home, right? If you left your home and left everything, many of these women, when they showed up from Mecca to Medina, many of these women showed up in Medina, they didn't have husbands. They were divorced, right? Because many of them converted to Islam and some of their husbands did not convert to Islam. So they left them. So they showed up, many of them showed up single. Many of these women, when they showed up with children because many of them migrated. They took their children with them. They left Mecca and they fled to Medina, taking their children with them. So they show up with, guys, make sure your microphones are muted, please. They show up single. They show up with children. Many of them, took orphans. They had orphans with them that they were taking care of, that they were responsible for. So they're showing up in Medina, some of them with only the clothes that they had on their backs. They didn't show up with a huge wardrobe, right? They didn't show up in Medina with all of their clothes, all of their wardrobes, all of their shoes and their bags and their handbags. They left with the clothes that were on their backs. Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she mentioned in a hadith, he said, Yarhamullah nisa al-muhajirat al-uwal. May Allah have mercy on the muhajirat, the immigrant women from the early period of Islam. May Allah have mercy on the immigrant women from the early period of Islam. He said, she said, لَمَّا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ جَلَّ وَعَلَى, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the ayat for women to cover. وَلِيَضْرِبْنَا بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, and let the women draw their veils, draw their khimars, draw their headscarves over their entire bodies. When Allah revealed that ayat, Aisha said, شَقَقْنَا مُرُوتَهُنَّ وَاخْتَمَرْنَا بِهَا. These women, they begin to tear the bottoms of their dresses and to wrap their heads with it. They made scarves, headscarves, out of the material that was dragging on the ground from, the excess material of their skirts. Their dresses used to drag on the ground. As we talked about before, this gave women prestige, gave men prestige. Men were prohibited from wearing their clothes like that, but women were not. Women were not. Because the longer the garment, the more of the body it's covering. So these women, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the ayah to cover, these women, without waiting, without procrastinating, without saying, I'm on my journey and all of the other excuses that many women come up with today, simply because they're just not ready to submit. Meanwhile, the whole entire religion is centered on the quality of submission. That's what Islam means. To submit. Islam does not mean peace. It means to submit. And these women were the epitome of submission. They defined submission because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to cover, they took the excess material from their garments and they ripped it off and they began to cover their hair. And Aisha said, subhanAllah, these women, may Allah have mercy upon them, these women would probably have been excused for not covering at all, considering that the only garments they had were the garments that they had on their backs. They left Mecca, migrated to Medina with only the clothes that they had on their backs. To such a degree that even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to cover, they tore the one garment they had just to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and cover their hair. La ilaha illallah. While you have many women today who will have a whole closet full of abayas, whole closet full of overgarments, and still choose to come outside half-clad, barely covered, not meeting the Islamic standard of a hijab. The Islamic standard of hijab. And so Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she said, may Allah have mercy on these women, showing you their condition, how they showed up in Medina. So these women are showing up single. These women are showed up widowed. Some of their husbands died along the way. Some of these women, they had to leave their husbands. Some of these women are showing up as single mothers with children from previous marriages. But all in all, these women showed up. And so the men in Medina, they're looking at these immigrant women like, I'm not marrying any one of these women. These women are a burden. And so the Prophet ﷺ, to preserve and to protect their honor and to still advocate for them even under the circumstances that they were in, he said the best of women, or rakibn al-ibil, the best of women are the women who ride camels. Salihu nisa al-Quraysh, the righteous women from Quraysh, meaning from Mecca. These women, ahnahu ala waladin fi sigrihi, these women are compassionate and merciful to children in their youth. Wa ar'ahu ala zawjin fi dhati yadi. And they preserve and protect the property and wealth of the husband in their absence. Let's unpack those two qualities, because these are the qualities that a man would marry for. That I want to marry a woman who's going to, be compassionate and merciful with my children. And I'm going to marry a woman who's going to protect my honor, protect my wealth, protect the things that I covet as a man in my absence. So the Prophet ﷺ, he's advocating for these women. Whereas in today's time, unfortunately, with many African-American men, we have totally abandoned our women. I'm not marrying an African-American woman. I don't want to be married to a sister who is African-American. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to marry this Arab sister over here. I'm going to marry this foreign sister over here. I'm done with, women from my culture. You have many brothers who think like this. Would never advocate for their women from their culture. Look at how African American women show up in Islam. When they show up, how do they show up? They show up beat up, tore up from the dunya, from the same men who convert to Islam, and now all of a sudden you are enlightened, and now these women are no longer good enough for you. Meanwhile, the reason why these women are the way that they are, because they come from a culture that you helped create as a man. The culture you helped create. The strip club culture, the rap music culture that demeans and degrades and belittles women. The culture of, physical abuse, violence against women. This same culture, this is the culture. The culture of, smash and dash, the culture of, get this woman pregnant so she can be my baby mother, the baby mother culture. And then these women show up in Islam, convert to Islam, show up in the deen, and now all of a sudden these women are not good enough for you. Because they have issues. I don't want to marry a sister with children. And all of the other excuses that we come up with, not advocating for women that come from where we come from. The Prophet ﷺ never forgot that. As a matter of fact, the only woman that the Prophet ﷺ married that was not from Quraysh was Safiya. Safiya bint Huyy, who was a Jewish woman. But every other woman the Prophet ﷺ married, he married them, they were from Mecca. He didn't marry any of the women from Medina. And when he was asked, would you marry a woman from Medina? He said no, because the women of Medina are extremely jealous. Every one of his wives, with the exception of Safiya, were from Mecca. He married from, and that's not to say that a man cannot marry outside of his race, outside of his culture. Islam does not put any restrictions on that. But what I am highlighting is the disdain that some African American men have for African American women as a whole, without exception. And so, inshallah ta'ala, we'll stop here. We'll unpack the rest of this hadith after the salat, inshallah ta'ala. We're going to pray salatul maghrib, and then we'll come back and we'll finish.